I was staying at my sister Maya's apartment in Portland when everything started going wrong. I'd been feeling sick for days, but that Tuesday night, the pain in my side became unbearable. Sharp, stabbing pain that made me double over and vomit bile into Maya's kitchen sink. "Maya?" I gasped, clutching the counter. "Something's really wrong. I need to go to the hospital." Her boyfriend Derek looked up from his video game and rolled his eyes. "Oh great, here we go with the drama again. What is it this time, Ashley? Cramps?" Maya glanced between us nervously. She'd been different since Derek moved in 6 months ago. Quieter, always apologizing for things that weren't her fault. "Derek, she looks really pale," Maya said softly. "Maybe we should..." "Should what? Waste 3 hours in the ER because Princess here ate some bad sushi?" Derek paused his game and turned around fully. "I'm not driving anywhere. Figure it out yourself." The pain hit again, worse this time. I collapsed to my knees on their kitchen floor, clutching my right side. It felt like someone was twisting a knife between my ribs. I couldn't catch my breath. "Please," I begged. "I can't drive like this, the pain." "Then call an Uber," Derek snorted. "Or better yet, call your mommy and daddy." "Oh wait, they're tired of your shit too, aren't they? He wasn't wrong." I'd been crashing at Maya's for 2 weeks after another fight with our parents about my college choices. They thought I was being dramatic about everything, just like Derek did, just like everyone always did. Maya knelt down beside me, her hands shaking. "Ash, what kind of pain is it? Where exactly?" "Lower right side," I managed between gasps. "It's getting worse. I think it might be my appendix." Derek laughed. Actually laughed. "Appendix? Seriously? What are you, WebMD now?" "Everyone thinks they have appendicitis when their stomach hurts." "Derek, please," Maya whispered. "What if she's right? Then she can call 911 herself. I'm not playing into this attention-seeking bullshit." He turned back to his game, cranking up the volume on his headset. I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. The operator answered on the second ring. "911, what's your emergency?" "I think I have appendicitis. I'm at 847 Pine Street, apartment 3B. The pain is severe and..." Derek lunged forward and grabbed my phone, hanging up before I could finish. "What the hell?" I screamed. "I'm not having paramedics show up here because you're being dramatic. Do you know what that looks like to the neighbors? To my landlord?" Derek pocketed my phone. "You want attention so bad, earn it somewhere else." The pain was getting worse, waves of agony that made me see spots. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. Maya caught me before I hit the floor completely. "Derek, she's burning up," Maya said, feeling my forehead. "She has a fever. So give her some Tylenol and call it a day." I looked at my sister, really looked at her. The way she flinched when Derek raised his voice, the bruise on her wrist that she kept covering with her sleeve, the way she'd stopped making eye contact with anyone, including me. "Maya," I whispered, "you know this isn't normal stomach pain. Please." She bit her lip, glancing at Derek nervously. Maybe we could just drive her to urgent care? Just to be safe? "We're not going anywhere." Derek stood up, towering over both of us. "And neither is she. End of discussion." "But what if..." I said end of discussion, Maya. The way he said her name made her shrink back. She'd been with Derek for 8 months, and in that time I'd watched my confidential, outspoken sister turn into someone I barely recognized. Someone who asked permission to have opinions. Another wave of pain hit, and I vomited again, this time with flecks of blood in it. Even Derek noticed that. "Gross. Clean that up," he said to Maya, not me. Maya looked like she wanted to say something, but instead she just went to get paper towels. I watched her clean up my blood-tinged vomit, while her boyfriend went back to his video game like nothing happened. "I need a hospital," I said again, weaker this time. The room was starting to spin. "You need to stop being dramatic," Derek replied without looking away from his screen. My vision was getting blurry. The pain was constant now, not coming in waves anymore, just a steady, crushing agony that made it hard to think straight. I knew enough about appendicitis to know that was bad. Really bad. "Maya, if my appendix ruptures..." I couldn't finish the sentence. The room tilted sideways. "That doesn't happen to healthy people," Derek said. "You're what, 20? You're fine." But I wasn't fine. I could feel something inside me giving way, like a dam bursting. The pain shifted from sharp to deep and spreading. My whole abdomen felt like it was on fire. I tried to grab Maya's hand. "Please, I'm scared." She looked at Derek, then back at me. "Derek, what if she's really sick? What if something happens?" "Nothing's going to happen because nothing's wrong." "She's manipulating you, Maya. This is what she does. Creates drama, makes everything about her." The cruelest part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I had always been the dramatic one in our family. The one who cried too easily, felt things too deeply, made mountains out of molehills. But this wasn't that. This was different. "I know you think I'm being dramatic," I said to both of them, "but I'm not. Something is really wrong inside me." Derek finally turned around. "Prove it." "What?" "Prove you're actually sick. Stop writhing around on the floor like you're dying and prove there's something medically wrong with you." I stared at him. "How am I supposed to prove that without going to a hospital?" "Not my problem. You made the claim. Back it up." The absurdity of it would have been funny if I wasn't in agony. He wanted me to diagnose myself to his satisfaction before he'd allow me to seek medical care. Maya looked torn. Derek, even if there's just a chance. There's a chance of a lot of things, Maya. Doesn't mean we panic every time Ashley has a tummy ache. This isn't a tummy ache, I yelled, using what energy I had left. I think my appendix just ruptured. You think, Derek repeated mockingly. You think. You don't know anything. He was right about that too. I didn't know for certain, but the pain had changed in a way that made my whole body scream danger. It was spreading across my abdomen like fire, and I was getting chills despite the fever. Please just let me call 911 again, I begged. No. Derek. I said, no, Maya. We're not doing this. I tried to reach for the landline phone on their kitchen counter, but Derek intercepted me. He was bigger and stronger, and in my current state, I couldn't fight him off. Give me the phone, I pleaded. Absolutely not. Then you call! You call 911 and tell them I need an ambulance. I'm not calling anyone because you don't need anything except maybe some Pepto-Bismol and a reality check. Maya stood frozen between us, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. Derek, please. What if you're wrong? I'm not wrong. Look at her, Maya. Really look. Does she look like someone whose appendix just ruptured? She's still talking, still moving around, still making demands. It was true that I was still conscious and coherent, but I could feel that changing. The spreading pain was making me nauseous in a different way, and my heart was racing like I'd been running. People don't just die from appendicitis anymore, Derek continued. This isn't the 1800s. If something was really that wrong, she'd be unconscious by now. I wanted to argue with him, but I was starting to feel confused. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just really bad gas or food poisoning or something. But then another wave hit, and this time I couldn't help but scream. The sound that came out of me didn't sound human. It was pure animal panic. Maya started crying harder. That doesn't sound like gas, Derek. It sounds like someone who's learned that making noise gets attention. I curled into a ball on their kitchen floor, hugging my knees to my chest. Everything hurt now, not just the right side. My whole torso felt inflamed and wrong. I'm going to die, I whispered, and for the first time since this started, I actually believed it. You're not going to die, Derek said impatiently. Stop being so fucking dramatic. But Maya heard something in my voice that made her step toward me. Ashley? I can't feel my legs properly, I said. My hands were tingling too, and I was having trouble focusing my eyes. That's because you're hyperventilating, Derek said. You're working yourself into a panic attack. Maybe he was right about that part, but the pain in my abdomen was definitely real, definitely getting worse, and definitely not something I was imagining. Maya, please, I whispered. I know you don't want to upset Derek, but I'm your sister. I'm begging you. She looked at Derek, then back at me. For a moment, I thought she might actually do something. Stand up to him. Choose me over him just this once. But then Derek walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. Hey, look at me. She looked up at him with those scared, apologetic eyes. Your sister is fine, he said softly, almost gently. She's having a panic attack because she's worked herself up over nothing. If you give in to this, you're just enabling her. Maya nodded slowly, like she was being hypnotized. We're not calling 911, Derek continued. We're not going to the hospital. We're going to let Ashley calm down and realize she's okay. But what if? No what ifs, trust me. The way he said trust me made my skin crawl. It was the voice of someone who'd been systematically destroying my sister's ability to trust her own judgment. I watched Maya's face crumble as she chose Derek over me. Again, I'm sorry, Ash, she whispered. Maybe Derek's right. Maybe you just need to rest. That's when I knew I was truly alone. I stopped begging. I stopped arguing. I just lay there on their cold kitchen floor and tried to conserve whatever strength I had left. Time moved strangely after that. Derek went back to his video game. Maya sat at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. I drifted in and out of consciousness on the floor between them. At some point, I heard Maya say, Derek, she's been quiet for a while. Should I check on her? Leave her alone. She'll snap out of it when she gets tired of the act. But I wasn't acting. I was going into shock. My body temperature was dropping despite the infection raging inside me. My heart was working overtime, trying to compensate for the toxins flooding my system. I must have lost consciousness completely, because the next thing I remember was Maya shaking my shoulder. Ashley? Ashley, wake up! I opened my eyes, but everything was foggy. Maya's face looked strange, like I was seeing her through water. She's not responding normally. Maya said to Derek, panic creeping into her voice. She's just sleeping it off. Derek, her skin feels cold and clammy, and look at her colour. I couldn't see myself, but I could feel that something fundamental had changed in my body. The sharp pain had given way to a deep spreading sickness that felt like poison in my veins. We have to call someone, Maya said, stronger this time. We're not calling anyone. Derek, I think her appendix really did rupture. I think she's going septic. You don't know what septic means. I do know what septic means. I'm a nursing student. That was news to me. Maya had dropped out of college when she started dating Derek, but apparently she'd been taking classes again without telling the family. If someone's appendix ruptures and they don't get treatment, they can die from the infection, Maya continued. The bacteria spreads throughout their abdominal cavity and then into their bloodstream. She's not septic, Derek said, but he sounded less certain than before. Look at her, Derek. Really look at her. There was a long pause. I felt Derek's presence near me, though I couldn't focus my eyes enough to see him clearly. Shit, he said quietly. We have to call 911 now, Maya said. No, we call my cousin Rick. He's a paramedic. He can tell us if it's serious enough for the hospital. Derek. We call Rick first. I wanted to protest, but I couldn't make my mouth work properly. Every system in my body was shutting down to focus on fighting the infection spreading through my abdomen. Maya made the call to Rick while I lay there slipping away. I heard fragments of the conversation through my haze. Been in pain for hours. Wouldn't let her call 911. Skin is cold and she's not really responding. Then Derek grabbed the phone away from Maya. Rick, it's Derek. Look, Ashley's being dramatic as usual, but Maya's freaking out. What do you mean, how long has she been like this? I don't know. Couple hours maybe. There was a pause, then Derek's voice changed completely. Are you serious? How serious? Shit, okay, we'll meet you there. He hung up and turned to Maya. Get your keys. We're going to the hospital. Now. What did Rick say? He said if someone's appendix ruptures and they don't get antibiotics within a few hours, they can die. Maya started crying with relief and terror. Oh God, how long has it been? Too long, Derek said grimly. They tried to wake me enough to walk, but my legs wouldn't support my weight. Derek ended up carrying me to Maya's car while she ran ahead to start the engine. The drive to the hospital was a blur of Maya running red lights and Derek calling ahead to the emergency room. I remember him saying, possible ruptured appendix, patient is going into shock, and thinking that was the first true thing he'd said all night. When we got to the ER, everything happened fast. Nurses surrounded me with machines and IV bags and concerned voices. Someone cut off my shirt. Someone else was taking my blood pressure and shaking their head. How long has she been symptomatic? A doctor asked. Maya and Derek looked at each other. About 6 hours, Maya said quietly. 6 hours with a ruptured appendix and no medical intervention. The doctor's voice was sharp. Why didn't you bring her in sooner? We thought, Maya started, then stopped. We thought she was exaggerating, Derek finished. The doctor looked at them like they were insane, which they were. Exaggerating a medical emergency? She has a history of being dramatic, Derek said weakly. Dramatic doesn't rupture an appendix, the doctor snapped. Get her to OR3 now. As they wheeled me towards surgery, I caught a glimpse of Maya's face. She looked absolutely destroyed, like she'd realized exactly what Derek had almost let happen to me. Derek looked scared but also angry, like this was somehow still my fault for making him look bad in front of the medical staff. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia kicked in was a nurse asking Maya, has your sister been trying to get medical help this whole time? Maya nodded, tears streaming down her face. And you prevented her from calling 911? Her boyfriend did, Maya whispered. I should have helped her. I went under thinking about that word. Boyfriend. Not even husband. Not even fiancé. Maya had almost let me die to avoid upsetting her boyfriend. I woke up 3 days later in the ICU with a ventilator down my throat and more tubes than I could count. Maya was asleep in the chair next to my bed holding my hand. When she saw I was awake, she started crying immediately. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Ashley. I couldn't talk with the breathing tube, but I squeezed her hand to let her know I heard her. Derek's gone, she said. I kicked him out. I should have done it a long time ago. A nurse came in to check my vitals and explain what had happened. My appendix had ruptured completely, causing peritonitis and sepsis. The infection had spread throughout my abdominal cavity and into my bloodstream. I'd been in septic shock by the time I reached the hospital. Another hour and we would have lost her, the nurse told Maya. Maybe less. Maya started crying again. I almost let her die. You brought her here in time, the nurse said gently. That's what matters. But we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. Maya had brought me here in time, but only after watching me suffer for hours, only after nearly letting Derek's control and manipulation cost me my life. The surgeon came by later that day to explain the extent of the damage. They'd had to remove not just my appendix, but also clean out infected tissue from throughout my abdominal cavity. I'd need at least 2 more surgeries to fully repair everything. The good news is that you're young and healthy, he said. You should make a full recovery. But I have to ask, why did you wait so long to seek treatment? Maya answered for me since I still couldn't talk. Her boyfriend, my boyfriend, he wouldn't let her call 911. He thought she was faking. The surgeon's expression darkened. He wouldn't let her? He took her phone when she tried to call. He said she was being dramatic. And you agreed with him? Maya's face crumpled. I was scared of him. I've been scared of him for months. But that's no excuse. I should have protected my sister. The surgeon made some notes in my chart. I'm going to have to report this incident. What your boyfriend did constitutes medical neglect at minimum. Ex-boyfriend, Maya corrected quietly. After the surgeon left, Maya and I had our first real conversation since I'd been conscious. She told me everything about Derek that I'd suspected but wanted to believe. How he'd gradually isolated her from friends and family. How he controlled their finances and monitored her phone. How he'd convinced her that her own thoughts and instincts were wrong. How he'd been slowly destroying her sense of reality for months. I know none of that excuses what I did, she said, or what I didn't do. I let him convince me that you were just being dramatic, but part of me knew better. I knew you were really sick. Why didn't you trust that part? I wrote on a piece of paper since I still couldn't speak. Maya was quiet for a long time, because trusting myself had become so hard. Derek had spent months teaching me that my judgment was wrong, that I was too emotional, that I needed him to tell me what was real. When you were in pain, I wanted to help you, but Derek seemed so certain that you were faking, and I'd learned to believe him over myself. She started crying again. I almost killed you because I'd forgotten how to trust my own eyes. The recovery was long and complicated. 2 more surgeries to repair the damage from the infection, weeks of antibiotics and physical therapy, months of probiotics to restore my gut health after the massive doses of medication. But the physical healing was nothing compared to the psychological aftermath. Maya went into therapy immediately and started working on undoing the damage Derek had done to her sense of reality. She moved back in with our parents and slowly started rebuilding the relationships Derek had made her neglect. As for Derek, he disappeared completely after Maya kicked him out. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what he'd almost caused. Just gone. Like he'd never existed. The police investigated the incident as potential criminal medical neglect, but Derek's lawyer argued that he wasn't legally responsible for my medical decisions. The DA eventually decided not to press charges, saying it would be too difficult to prove intent to harm, so Derek faced no legal consequences for nearly letting me die. No consequences at all, really, except losing Maya. And knowing Derek, he probably just found some other vulnerable woman to control and manipulate. That realization haunted me during my recovery. Derek was out there somewhere, probably doing to someone else exactly what he'd done to Maya, teaching another woman not to trust her own judgment, setting up another situation where someone might suffer or die because of his need for control. Maya struggled with the same thoughts. She joined a support group for domestic abuse survivors and learned that Derek's behavior followed a textbook pattern. The isolation, the reality distortion, the gradual erosion of self-trust, it was all deliberate. I keep thinking about all the red flags I ignored, she told me one day while I was still recovering. How he always had to be right about everything. How he made me feel stupid for having different opinions. How he got angry when I talked to other people about our relationship. When did you realize it was abuse? I asked. Honestly? Not until that night. I thought abuse had to be hitting. I didn't understand that destroying someone's ability to think clearly is abuse, too. We talked a lot during those months about how Derek had managed to convince Maya to distrust herself so completely. It hadn't happened overnight. It was a gradual process of undermining her confidence and making her dependent on his version of reality. He'd pick fights about small things and then act like I was crazy for being upset, Maya explained. Like, I'd say the restaurant service was slow, and he'd insist it was perfectly normal. Then he'd spend 20 minutes explaining why my perception was wrong and I was being unreasonable. That sounds exhausting. It was. Eventually, it was easier to just agree with him than to argue. But agreeing with him meant not trusting my own experiences. The therapist Maya was seeing called it gaslighting, a systematic attempt to make someone question their own sanity. Derek had been doing it to Maya for months, preparing her to doubt herself in exactly the kind of situation we'd found ourselves in that night. The scariest part, Maya said, is how natural it felt to turn to him for guidance when you were sick. I'd been trained to think his judgment was better than mine. 6 months after my surgery, I was physically recovered, but still processing the psychological impact of nearly dying because someone else decided my pain wasn't real. It made me think about all the times throughout my life when people had dismissed my experiences or feelings as dramatic. How many times had I learned to doubt myself because someone else insisted I was overreacting? Maya and I both started therapy to work through these issues. We learned about medical gaslighting, where doctors dismiss patients' symptoms, especially women's symptoms. We learned about how trauma can make people seem dramatic when they're actually responding appropriately to danger. Most importantly, we learned to trust ourselves again. Maya's recovery was remarkable. Within a year, she'd finished nursing school and started working in an emergency room. She became an advocate for domestic violence survivors and trained to recognize the signs of abuse in her patients. I never want anyone to go through what we went through, she told me. I want to be the nurse who believes people when they say something's wrong. As for me, I changed my major to social work and started volunteering with organizations that help abuse survivors. I wanted to understand how people like Derek operate and how to help their victims rebuild their sense of reality. But even now, 3 years later, I sometimes catch myself doubting my own perceptions when I'm in pain or distress. Derek's voice echoes in my head. You're being dramatic. You're exaggerating. You don't know what you're talking about. The difference is that now I recognize that voice as his, not mine. And I know that my experiences are valid, regardless of how anyone else interprets them. Maya and I are closer now than we've ever been. We've learned to trust each other and to validate each other's experiences, even when they're uncomfortable or inconvenient. We've also learned to forgive ourselves for that night. Maya forgives herself for being so controlled by Derek that she couldn't help me. I forgive myself for needing help in the first place, because the truth is, none of it was our fault. Derek created a situation where my medical emergency became a test of loyalty, where Maya had to choose between helping me and avoiding his anger. That's not a choice anyone should have to make. And it's not a choice Maya will ever have to make again. The investigation into Derek's behavior revealed more than we'd initially realized. When the hospital social worker interviewed Maya during my recovery, she uncovered a pattern of medical control that had been going on for months before my crisis. Maya admitted that Derek had prevented her from seeking medical care on multiple occasions. When she'd gotten a severe ear infection 6 months earlier, Derek convinced her it was just allergies and made her suffer for 2 weeks before finally agreeing to let her see a doctor. The infection had spread so badly that she'd needed IV antibiotics and nearly lost hearing in her left ear. There was also the time Maya had fallen down the stairs and complained of wrist pain for days. Derek insisted she was being a baby and refused to let her get it x-rayed. It turned out she'd been walking around with a hairline fracture for 3 weeks. The bone had started healing incorrectly by the time she finally got treatment, and now she has chronic pain in that wrist. He always made me feel like I was weak for needing medical care, Maya told the social worker. Like wanting to see a doctor was a character flaw. The social worker explained that medical control was a common form of domestic abuse. Abusers often restrict their victims' access to healthcare as a way of maintaining control and dependency. They downplay symptoms, prevent doctor visits, or even sabotage medical treatments. Your sister's appendicitis crisis wasn't an isolated incident, she told us. It was the culmination of a long pattern of medical neglect and abuse. This information was devastating to Maya, who realized she'd been living in an abusive relationship for much longer than she'd understood. But it was also validating, because it meant her instincts about needing medical care had been correct all along. The hospital filed a report with Adult Protective Services, which launched their own investigation. They interviewed Maya's former co-workers, who confirmed that Derek had often prevented Maya from calling in sick or leaving work for medical appointments. One supervisor remembered Maya coming to work with a 102-degree fever because Derek convinced her she was just being dramatic. Maya's best friend from college, Jessica, came forward with her own observations. She'd noticed changes in Maya's behavior over the past year, but hadn't known how to address them. Maya used to be so decisive and confident, Jessica told the investigator. But whenever Derek was around, she'd second-guess everything. She'd ask him for permission to order food at restaurants or choose what movie to watch. It was like she'd forgotten how to think for herself. Jessica also revealed that Derek had systematically isolated Maya from her support network. He'd convinced Maya that her friends were toxic and jealous of their relationship. He'd created conflicts between Maya and her family by spreading lies and manipulating situations. He told Maya that her parents thought she was stupid for dropping out of college, Jessica said. But when I talked to her mom, she said they'd never said anything like that. Derek was making it up to drive a wedge between them. The pattern was becoming clear. Derek hadn't just controlled Maya's medical decisions, he'd controlled her entire reality. He'd systematically destroyed her ability to trust herself, her friends, her family, and her own perceptions. During one therapy session, Maya broke down completely as she realized the extent of Derek's manipulation. "I used to be a strong person," she sobbed. "I had opinions. I made decisions. I trusted myself. How did I let him take all of that away from me?" Her therapist, Dr. Rachel Chen, explained that this kind of psychological manipulation is incredibly insidious. "Abusers don't start with the big stuff," she said. "They start small. They question your judgment about tiny things until you start questioning yourself about everything." Dr. Chen walked Maya through the process Derek had used to break down her psychological defenses. It had started with small criticisms disguised as helpful advice. "You might want to reconsider that outfit," or "Are you sure that's the right way to load the dishwasher?" Then it escalated to undermining her relationships. Derek would point out flaws in Maya's friends and family, slowly convincing her that they didn't have her best interests at heart. Only he truly cared about her. Only he could be trusted. By the time he was controlling your medical decisions, Dr. Chen explained, he'd already trained you to distrust your own judgment about everything else. The groundwork was laid months before your sister's crisis. This understanding helped Maya stop blaming herself for what happened to me. She began to see that Derek's manipulation had been deliberate and systematic, not something she could have easily recognized or resisted. But the healing process was far from simple. Maya had nightmares for months about that night. She'd wake up screaming, reliving the moment when she chose Derek's authority over my obvious distress. The guilt was overwhelming. "I keep seeing your face when you were begging me to help," she told me one day. "I keep thinking about how scared you must have been, lying there knowing something was seriously wrong, while the two people who were supposed to protect you just watched you suffer." I struggled with my own trauma from that night. Beyond the physical pain and medical complications, there was the psychological wound of being dismissed and disbelieved when I was at my most vulnerable. The worst part wasn't even the pain, I told my therapist. It was feeling so alone. Having my own sister choose someone else's opinion over my obvious distress. It made me question whether I could trust anyone to believe me when I say something's wrong. My therapist, Dr. Maria Santos, helped me understand that medical trauma is real and can have lasting psychological effects. When someone dismisses your pain or symptoms, especially during a medical emergency, it can create a deep sense of helplessness and vulnerability, she explained. I started having panic attacks whenever I felt any kind of physical discomfort. A headache would make me afraid that something serious was wrong and no one would believe me. Stomach cramps would trigger flashbacks to that night on Derek's kitchen floor. Dr. Santos taught me grounding techniques to manage these panic responses. She also helped me rebuild trust in my own body and my ability to advocate for myself medically. Derek's voice in your head telling you that you're being dramatic is not your voice, she reminded me repeatedly. Your experiences are valid. Your pain is real. You have the right to seek medical care whenever you feel you need it. The legal aftermath of my case was frustrating and eye-opening. While the police investigation into Derek's actions had stalled, we decided to pursue civil remedies. Our lawyer, Jennifer Walsh, specialized in medical negligence cases and was appalled by what Derek had done. "I've seen plenty of cases where medical professionals failed patients," she told us during our first consultation. "But I've never seen a case where a non-medical person actively prevented someone from accessing emergency care. This is uncharted territory." Jennifer explained that we could potentially sue Derek for intentional infliction of emotional distress, medical negligence, and interference with emergency services. The challenge would be proving that his actions directly caused additional harm beyond what the ruptured appendix would have caused naturally. "The key evidence will be the medical testimony about timing," she said. "We need to show that with prompt medical attention, Ashley's outcome would have been significantly better." Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency room physician who treated me, was willing to testify about the importance of the delayed treatment. "In cases of appendicitis, every hour matters," she explained during her deposition. The patient presented with clear signs of septic shock that could have been prevented with earlier intervention. She walked through the timeline in devastating detail. "If I'd reached the hospital when I first tried to call 911, they would have caught the appendix before it ruptured. Instead of major abdominal surgery and a week in the ICU, I would have had a simple laparoscopic procedure and gone home the next day. The delay directly caused the patient's appendix to rupture, leading to peritonitis, sepsis, and multiple additional surgeries," Dr. Williams testified. "This was an entirely preventable medical disaster." But Derek's defense team, led by attorney Robert Morrison, painted a different picture. They argued that Derek had no medical training and couldn't have known the severity of my condition. They claimed he was simply trying to prevent an unnecessary emergency room visit. My client is not a doctor, Morrison argued during his opening statement. He had no way of knowing that Miss Ashley was experiencing a genuine medical emergency. Based on his past experiences with the plaintiff, he reasonably believed she was exaggerating her symptoms. This line of defense was particularly painful because it relied on portraying me as someone who routinely faked or exaggerated medical problems. Derek's lawyers dug into my entire medical history, looking for evidence that I was a hypochondriac or attention seeker. They found ammunition in my teenage years when I'd gone to the emergency room twice for panic attacks that I'd thought were heart problems. They brought up every doctor's visit, every symptom I'd ever reported, and tried to paint a picture of someone who couldn't be trusted to accurately assess her own medical needs. The plaintiff has a documented history of seeking unnecessary medical attention for psychological issues disguised as physical symptoms, Morrison argued. My client's skepticism was not only reasonable, but justified. Maya was devastated by this line of attack. She felt responsible for providing Derek with the ammunition he was using against me. I told him about your panic attacks when we first started dating, she confessed, crying. I thought I was just sharing family stories. I didn't know he was filing it all away to use against you someday. The character assassination was brutal, but not entirely surprising. What shocked us was how effectively Derek's team managed to flip the narrative. Instead of being seen as a victim of medical neglect, I was portrayed as a manipulative person who'd finally faced consequences for crying wolf. Derek himself was presented as a reasonable man who'd been trying to protect his girlfriend from her sister's manipulative behavior. He testified that I had a pattern of creating dramatic situations whenever I wasn't getting enough attention. Ashley always had to be the center of attention, Derek said on the stand, looking directly at the jury. She'd create these situations where everyone had to drop everything and focus on her. Maya had told me about previous incidents where Ashley had claimed to be seriously ill when nothing was actually wrong. He spoke smoothly and confidently, painting himself as the victim of my alleged manipulation. He claimed that my demands for medical attention that night were just another example of my attention-seeking behavior. I was trying to protect Maya from being manipulated again, he said. I'd seen how Ashley's false alarms in the past had upset her, and I didn't want Maya to go through that emotional turmoil again. The most infuriating part was how reasonable Derek sounded. He admitted to taking my phone, but framed it as preventing me from making an unnecessary 911 call that would have wasted emergency resources. I've seen the news stories about people who abuse the 911 system, he testified. I thought I was being a responsible citizen by preventing a false alarm. When Jennifer cross-examined Derek, she tried to poke holes in his story. She focused on the fact that he'd seen me vomiting blood and had a high fever, asking how those symptoms could possibly be faked. You saw blood in her vomit, correct? Jennifer asked. I saw what appeared to be blood, Derek replied carefully. But I've also seen people bite their tongues or cheeks to create that effect. Are you suggesting that my client deliberately injured herself to make her symptoms appear more serious? I'm saying that people who are desperate for attention will go to extreme lengths. Jennifer pressed him on the fever, asking how someone could fake a temperature of 103 degrees. There are ways to artificially raise your body temperature, Derek said. Hot baths, heating pads, even certain medications. Did you see my client take any steps to artificially raise her temperature? No, but I wasn't watching her every second. The exchange was maddening because Derek had an answer for everything. No matter how unreasonable his explanations were, he delivered them with such confidence that some jury members seemed to find them plausible. Maya's testimony was the most difficult part of the trial. She had to walk through her own abuse and explain how Derek's control had influenced her decision-making that night. I knew Ashley was really sick, she said, crying on the stand. Every instinct I had told me she needed medical help, but Derek had spent months teaching me not to trust my instincts. Morrison's cross-examination of Maya was particularly brutal. He portrayed her as an unreliable witness who was now blaming Derek for her own poor decisions. You're an adult woman, are you not, Ms. Maya? Morrison asked. Yes. And you're capable of making your own decisions? Yes, but so when you chose not to help your sister that night, that was your choice, wasn't it? Maya broke down completely. He had trained me not to trust myself. I didn't know how to think anymore. But you're asking this jury to believe that you had no agency in that decision? That you were somehow forced to abandon your sister? I was psychologically controlled. That's not a recognized legal defense, is it? Psychological control doesn't absolve you of responsibility for your actions, does it? The cross-examination was devastating. Morrison made Maya sound like someone who was making excuses for her own moral failures rather than someone who'd been systematically abused and manipulated. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they finally returned, their verdict was split. They found Derek liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress, but not for medical negligence. The damage award was much smaller than we'd hoped. $75,000 instead of the $500,000 we'd sought. The jury believed that Derek's actions caused you emotional harm, Jennifer explained afterward. But they weren't convinced that the medical outcome would have been significantly different with earlier treatment. It felt like a partial victory at best. Derek would have to pay something for what he'd done, but not nearly enough to reflect the true cost of his actions. The medical bills alone had exceeded $200,000. Worse, the verdict seemed to validate Derek's portrayal of me as someone whose distress was primarily psychological rather than medical. The jury had essentially agreed that while Derek shouldn't have been so cruel, my physical suffering wasn't entirely his fault. Maya was devastated by the outcome. She felt like the trial had re-traumatized both of us while failing to hold Derek truly accountable. I thought if we could just tell the truth, people would understand what he did to us, she said. I didn't realize how good he'd be at making himself look like the victim. The trial had one expected positive outcome, though. Maya's testimony about psychological control and domestic abuse resonated with several women in the courtroom. 3 different women approached her after the verdict to share their own stories of medical control by abusive partners. One woman, Sarah, told Maya that her husband had prevented her from seeking treatment for chest pain that turned out to be a heart attack. Like Maya, she'd been trained to distrust her own medical instincts. I kept thinking I was being dramatic, Sarah said. He convinced me that women my age don't have heart attacks. I waited 6 hours before finally calling 911, and by then I'd sustained permanent heart damage. Another woman, Christine, shared how her boyfriend had convinced her that her severe headaches were just stress and that seeing a doctor would be a waste of money. She'd eventually been diagnosed with a brain tumor, but the delayed treatment had made surgery much more complicated. He kept saying I was being a hypochondriac, Christine said. I actually started to believe that the pain was all in my head. These conversations helped Maya understand that our experience wasn't isolated. Medical control appeared to be a widespread form of abuse that rarely got recognition or legal consequences. Maya and I decided to channel our frustration into advocacy. We started speaking at domestic violence organizations about medical control and the warning signs of this type of abuse. Most people think of domestic violence as physical, Maya would tell audiences, but psychological control can be just as dangerous, especially when it prevents someone from accessing medical care. We shared our story at hospitals, training medical professionals to recognize signs that a patient might be experiencing medical control. We pushed for policies that would allow patients to speak privately with medical staff, away from potentially controlling partners or family members. The speaking engagements were emotionally draining, but also therapeutic. Each time we told our story, we reclaimed a little more power from Derek. We turned our trauma into something that might help protect other people. Dr. Chen, Maya's therapist, encouraged this advocacy work as part of Maya's healing process. You're taking back control of the narrative, she explained. Instead of being passive victims of Derek's manipulation, you're actively working to prevent this from happening to others. One of our most impactful speaking engagements was at a medical conference in Seattle. We were sharing the stage with Dr. Williams and other emergency medicine physicians who'd seen similar cases. During the Q&A, a young resident asked how medical professionals could better identify patients who might be experiencing medical control. Look for partners who answer for the patient or seem overly invested in downplaying symptoms, Dr. Williams advised. Pay attention to patients who seem afraid to speak up or who constantly defer to someone else's judgment about their own body. Maya added her perspective. Also watch for patients who apologize excessively for seeking care or who seem surprised when medical staff take their symptoms seriously. Those can be signs that someone has been trained to view their medical needs as invalid or burdensome. After the conference, a nurse approached us with tears in her eyes. She told us about a patient she'd treated the week before, a young woman who'd come to the ER with severe abdominal pain, but whose boyfriend kept insisting she was just having bad period cramps. I almost sent her home because the boyfriend was so convincing, the nurse admitted. But after hearing your story, I insisted on examining her privately. It turned out she had ovarian torsion and needed emergency surgery. Her boyfriend's interference could have cost her her fertility or even her life. Stories like this made all the pain of the trial and advocacy work feel worthwhile. We were making a difference, preventing other people from experiencing what we'd been through. But the personal healing process was ongoing. Maya still struggled with trust issues and decision-making anxiety. She'd call me before making even simple choices, seeking validation that her judgment was sound. I'm terrified of making the wrong decision, she confessed during one of our weekly coffee dates. What if I trust myself and I'm wrong? What if I hurt someone because I relied on my own judgment instead of listening to someone who knows better? Her therapist was working with her on rebuilding confidence in her decision-making abilities. It was a slow process of starting with small, low-stakes choices and gradually working up to bigger decisions. Derek spent months teaching you that your judgment was unreliable, Dr. Chen explained. It's going to take time to unlearn that conditioning and rebuild trust in yourself. I was dealing with my own ongoing issues. While my physical recovery was complete, I still struggled with medical anxiety. Every small symptom sent me into a panic about whether I was overreacting or underreacting. I don't trust my own assessment of my symptoms anymore, I told Dr. Santos. If something hurts, I can't tell if it's serious or if I'm just being dramatic, like Derek said. Dr. Santos helped me develop a framework for assessing my symptoms objectively. She taught me to document what I was experiencing and to trust that seeking medical attention for concerning symptoms was always the right choice, regardless of what anyone else might think. Your body belongs to you, she reminded me repeatedly. You're the expert on what you're experiencing. No one else gets to decide whether your pain or discomfort is valid. 2 years after the trial, Maya and I received a message that changed everything. It was from a woman named Emily Chen, no relation to Maya's therapist, who'd seen one of our speaking engagements online. Emily told us that she'd been in an abusive relationship with Derek 3 years before he'd met Maya. Her story was eerily similar to Maya's. Derek had gradually isolated her from friends and family, controlled her finances, and undermined her confidence in her own judgment. He convinced me that I was mentally unstable and couldn't be trusted to make decisions about my own life, Emily wrote. When I had a skiing accident and broke my wrist, Derek insisted it was just a sprain and wouldn't let me go to the doctor for a week. By the time I finally got treatment, the bone had started healing incorrectly. Emily had eventually escaped the relationship, but she'd carried the psychological scars for years. She'd been in therapy and was now in a healthy relationship, but Derek's voice still echoed in her head during moments of self-doubt. Seeing your story made me realize that I wasn't Derek's only victim, she wrote. I'm wondering if there are others. Maybe if we band together, we can find a way to hold him accountable that the legal system couldn't. Emily's message opened the floodgates. Once we started looking, we found 2 other women who'd been in relationships with Derek over the past decade. The pattern was always the same: isolation, financial control, medical neglect, and systematic psychological manipulation. Sarah Martinez had been with Derek for 8 months in 2018. He'd convinced her that her chronic migraines were psychosomatic and prevented her from seeing a neurologist. She'd eventually been diagnosed with a treatable condition, but the delayed treatment had led to permanent vision problems. Rebecca Foster had dated Derek briefly in 2019. During their 6-month relationship, he'd convinced her that her family was toxic and manipulative. When Rebecca had a severe allergic reaction to medication, Derek insisted she was being dramatic and prevented her from calling 911. She'd ended up hospitalized for 3 days. The 4 of us, Maya, Emily, Sarah, Rebecca, and I, formed an informal support group. We met monthly to share our experiences and support each other's healing processes. It's incredible how similar his tactics were with all of us, Emily observed during one of our meetings. He had a playbook that he followed with each relationship. Sarah had kept a journal during her relationship with Derek, and reading excerpts from it was like hearing Maya's story all over again. Derek says, I'm being too sensitive about the migraines. Sarah read from an entry dated 6 months into their relationship. He's probably right. I always did overreact to pain. Maybe I should try harder to just deal with it instead of complaining all the time. The journal entries showed Derek's manipulation in real time, how he'd gradually convinced Sarah to doubt her own experiences and defer to his judgment about her medical needs. I wrote that entry 2 days before I ended up in the emergency room with a migraine so severe I couldn't see straight, Sarah said. But I still felt guilty for overreacting because Derek had spent months teaching me that my pain wasn't real. Rebecca shared similar stories about how Derek had convinced her that seeking medical attention was a sign of weakness. He'd make comments about how strong women handled pain without complaining, Rebecca told us. He made me feel like going to the doctor was admitting defeat. Our support group sessions were difficult but healing. We helped each other recognize Derek's manipulation tactics and work through the psychological damage he'd caused. More importantly, we started researching whether there might be legal recourse we hadn't considered. Emily had contacted a lawyer who specialized in pattern of abuse cases, and she thought there might be ground class action lawsuit. The individual incidents might not have been enough to hold Derek fully accountable, the lawyer, Patricia Hernandez, explained to us during a consultation. But together, they show a clear pattern of predatory behavior that repeatedly endangered women's health and safety. Patricia thought we might have grounds for a civil RICO case. arguing that Derek's pattern of psychological manipulation and medical neglect constituted a criminal enterprise. It's unconventional, she admitted, but the pattern is so clear and the harm is so consistent that it might work. The prospect of another legal battle was daunting, but all four of us felt ready to fight. We'd found strength in numbers and a sense of purpose in preventing Derek from continuing to harm other women. "He's still out there," Maya said during one of our planning meetings, "still doing this to someone else. We might be the only people who can stop him." The class action lawsuit was still in the early stages when we received another devastating piece of news. Emily had been doing research on Derek's background and discovered that he'd been married once before, in 2015. His ex-wife, Linda Peterson, had died in a car accident 2 years into their marriage. But according to the police reports Emily had obtained, Linda had been driving herself to the hospital when she'd crashed. The accident report indicated that Linda had been suffering from severe chest pain and had called Derek from her car, asking him to meet her at the emergency room. Instead, Derek had convinced her to come home first so he could assess whether she really needed medical attention. Linda had reluctantly agreed, but after an hour at home with Derek dismissing her symptoms as anxiety, she decided to drive herself to the hospital anyway. She'd passed out while driving and crashed into a tree. She died of a massive heart attack. The chest pain Derek had dismissed as psychological had been her heart muscle dying. The police had investigated Derek briefly, but there was no evidence of foul play. It appeared to be a tragic accident caused by a medical emergency. No one had looked into Derek's pattern of medical neglect or considered that his dismissal of Linda's symptoms might have contributed to her death. "He killed her," Maya said quietly after Emily shared the police reports with us. "Maybe not legally, but he killed her just like he almost killed Ashley." The discovery of Linda's death changed everything. We were no longer just victims of Derek's manipulation. We were potential witnesses to what might have been a preventable death. Patricia Hernandez was stunned when we brought her the information about Linda. "This changes the entire case," she said. "We're not just talking about medical neglect anymore. We're talking about a pattern of behavior that may have contributed to someone's death." She recommended that we contact the police and request a review of Linda's case in light of the new information about Derek's history. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who specialized in domestic violence cases, agreed to meet with us. She reviewed all our evidence, the hospital records from my appendicitis case, the documentation of Derek's abuse of Maya, and the stories from Emily, Sarah, and Rebecca. Individually, these incidents might not rise to the level of criminal charges, Detective Rodriguez told us, but together, they paint a picture of someone who systematically endangers women's health and safety. She agreed to work with the prosecutor's office to see if charges might be possible under Oregon's criminal endangerment statutes. "It's a long shot," she warned us. "But if we can establish a pattern of behavior that shows willful disregard for human life, we might have a case." The investigation took months. Derek had moved to Seattle after our civil trial, but he was still within reach of Oregon's jurisdiction for crimes committed in Portland. During the investigation, Detective Rodriguez uncovered additional evidence that strengthened our case. Derek's internet search history from the night of my appendicitis showed that he'd looked up symptoms of ruptured appendix on his phone. "This proves he knew how serious your condition was," Detective Rodriguez explained. "He wasn't just ignorant about medical issues. He was actively choosing to ignore clear warning signs." The search history showed that Derek had looked up ruptured appendix symptoms just hours before finally agreeing to take me to the hospital. He'd read about the danger of sepsis and the importance of immediate medical treatment, but had continued to prevent me from getting help. "This is premeditation," Patricia said when she saw the evidence. "He knew you were in mortal danger and chose to let you suffer anyway." The new evidence was enough for the prosecutor's office to file criminal charges. Derek was arrested in Seattle and extradited to Oregon to face charges of criminal endangerment, interfering with emergency services, and reckless endangerment. The criminal trial was very different from our civil case. This time, Derek couldn't hide behind claims of ignorance or good intentions. The prosecutor, Angela Mitchell, presented a clear timeline showing that Derek had known about the seriousness of my condition, but had chosen to prevent me from getting treatment anyway. The defendant looked up information about ruptured appendix on his phone at 9:47 p.m., Mitchell told the jury during her opening statement. He read about the life-threatening nature of this condition, yet he continued to prevent Ms. Ashley from accessing emergency medical care for another 2 hours. Derek's defense team tried to argue that looking up medical information didn't prove intent to harm, but the jury wasn't buying it. The pattern of behavior across multiple relationships, combined with the evidence of Derek's knowledge about my condition, painted a clear picture of someone who deliberately endangered women's lives. Maya's testimony in the criminal trial was much more powerful than it had been in civil court. She'd had 3 more years of therapy and advocacy work, and she spoke with confidence about Derek's pattern of abuse. Derek didn't just control my actions that night, Maya testified. He'd spent months systematically destroying my ability to trust my own judgment. By the time Ashley was in crisis, I'd been trained to believe that Derek's assessment of reality was more reliable than my own eyes. Emily, Sarah, and Rebecca also testified about their experiences with Derek. The jury heard a consistent pattern of medical neglect, psychological manipulation, and deliberate endangerment. Most powerfully, Linda Peterson's sister testified about the circumstances of Linda's death. She shared text messages Linda had sent her in the weeks before she died, messages that showed Derek's pattern of dismissing Linda's health concerns. Derek says, "I'm being a hypochondriac about the chest pain." Linda's sister read from one text message, "Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just stressed about work." Another message, sent just days before Linda's death, was even more telling. "Had chest pain again today. Derek got angry when I suggested going to the doctor. Says I'm turning into one of those women who runs to the ER for every little thing." The jury deliberated for less than a day. Derek was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 4 years in prison. "This defendant showed a callous disregard for human life," Judge Williams said during sentencing. "His pattern of behavior endangered multiple women and may have contributed to one woman's death. The court finds that a significant prison sentence is necessary to protect the public and to send a message that this type of behavior will not be tolerated." Derek's conviction made national news. Our case became a landmark example of how psychological manipulation and medical control could be prosecuted as criminal acts. Maya and I continued our advocacy work, now with the added credibility of Derek's criminal conviction. We spoke at law enforcement conferences, training police and prosecutors to recognize patterns of medical abuse. Derek's case shows that domestic violence isn't always physical, Maya would tell audiences. Sometimes the weapon is psychological manipulation, and sometimes the battlefield is access to medical care. We also worked with legislators to strengthen laws around medical neglect and interference with emergency services. Several states passed new laws specifically addressing the crime of preventing someone from accessing medical care. The healing process continued for all of us. Maya eventually felt confident enough to enter a new relationship with a man named Carlos, who respected her independence and supported her advocacy work. "Carlos encourages me to trust my own judgment," Maya told me. "When I'm uncertain about something, he helps me think through my options rather than telling me what to do." I also found love again, with someone who understood my medical anxiety and supported my healing process. When I had a minor health scare 2 years after Derek's conviction, my partner Michael drove me to the ER without question and sat with me through every test and examination. "You never have to justify seeking medical care to me," Michael told me that night. "Your health and safety are always the priority." The difference between Michael's response and Derek's response that night was like night and day. Where Derek had dismissed and belittled, Michael supported and validated. Where Derek had created barriers to care, Michael removed them. 5 years after my appendicitis, our advocacy work had reached thousands of people. We trained hundreds of medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and domestic violence counselors to recognize and respond to medical control. Most importantly, we'd heard from dozens of women who said our story had helped them recognize their own situations and seek help. "I saw your presentation and realized that my boyfriend's behavior wasn't normal," one woman wrote to us. "He'd been preventing me from seeing a doctor for chronic pain, saying I was just drug seeking. Thanks to your talk, I found the courage to leave him and get proper medical treatment. I was diagnosed with endometriosis and finally got the care I needed." Another woman told us that our story had helped her understand her ex-husband's behavior. "He used to get angry whenever I wanted to take our daughter to the pediatrician. I thought he was just being practical about money, but now I realize he was controlling our access to medical care as a way of maintaining power over us." Derek served his full 4-year sentence. He was released in 2029, and we heard through the Victim Services Coordinator that he'd moved to another state. As part of his parole conditions, he was required to attend counseling for domestic violence offenders and was prohibited from romantic relationships without his parole officer's approval. "It's not perfect," Maya said when we heard about his release, "but at least there are some safeguards in place now." We both knew that Derek would probably find ways to manipulate and control women again. People like him rarely change fundamentally. But we'd done everything we could to hold him accountable and to prevent others from experiencing what we'd been through. Our support group continued to meet monthly, even years after Derek's conviction. We'd become genuinely close friends, bonded by our shared experience and our commitment to helping others. "In a weird way, I'm grateful for what happened," Emily said during one of our meetings. "Not for the abuse itself, but for how it led us to each other and to this work we're doing." Rebecca nodded in agreement. Derek tried to isolate all of us and make us feel powerless, but instead we found each other and discovered our power to create change. Maya and I often reflected on how far we'd come that night in Derek's apartment. The scared, isolated women who'd let Derek control their reality had become confident advocates who'd helped change laws and save lives. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Derek had just let you call 911 that night, Maya mused during one of our conversations. I probably would have had simple appendix surgery and gone home the next day, I replied. But we never would have understood the full extent of his manipulation. We never would have found Emily, Sarah, and Rebecca. We never would have done this advocacy work. It was a sobering thought. In some ways, Derek's refusal to let me get medical help that night had ultimately led to his downfall and to protections for future victims. I'm not saying the ends justify the means, Maya said quickly. What Derek did was horrible, and you almost died. But maybe some good came out of it in the end. I agreed. While I wouldn't wish our experience on anyone, I was proud of how we turned our trauma into something meaningful. We'd taken Derek's attempt to silence and control us and used it to find our voices and help others. The last I heard, Derek was living in Arizona under close supervision by his parole officer. There had been no reports of new relationships or concerning behavior, but we remained vigilant. Maya and I had both become experts at recognizing the early warning signs of controlling behavior. We shared this knowledge widely, hoping to help other women identify and escape dangerous situations before they escalated. Trust your instincts, Maya would tell audiences. If someone is making you doubt your own judgment or preventing you from making decisions about your own body and health, those are serious red flags. We also emphasized the importance of maintaining connections with friends and family, even when a partner discourages those relationships. Isolation is one of an abuser's most powerful tools, I would explain. The more isolated you become, the more dependent you are on your abuser's version of reality. Our story had become a cautionary tale, but also a story of resilience and recovery. We'd survived Derek's manipulation and emerged stronger, more connected, and more committed to protecting others. In the end, Derek had tried to make us doubt ourselves, isolate us, and control our access to help and safety. Instead, he'd inadvertently brought us together, given us a shared purpose, and helped us find our voices as advocates and survivors. That's the thing about people like Derek. They think they hold all the power, but they underestimate the strength and resilience of their victims. Maya and I had learned that we were much stronger than Derek had ever given us credit for, and now we were using that strength to make sure no one else would have to endure what we'd been through.